And gentlemen, at any time, please interrupt me if you have questions or just anything that you want to ask about. If it pops into your head, I don't even care if it's subject relevant. Let's just go ahead and ask, right? Because probably, a dozen other people are probably interested. Because like 40 people were invited to the strategy sessions, and typically 2 to 5 people have shown up. So so there'll probably be some more people later. There's not an issue around attendance. I just want to make sure people get their questions asked. And so if you have questions, probably someone else does too. As you can see right now, you're part of like what we're calling the Booz Allen, the Booz Summer Acceleration Program. This is a push basically to achieve a certain additional level of certifications by Booz employees, basically by the end of the fiscal year, which I believe is October 1st. So for those of you who have a longer program, like a professional or specialty program, I probably mentioned to you, like this is one of the reasons why it's not the full 12-week program. You've got 10 weeks basically from this point forward. That being said, 10 weeks is more than enough if you're just willing to put in like maybe an extra hour per week, which typically it's about 3 to 5 hours. So let's say 3 to 6 in this case. So regardless of which level of certification you're going after, just to say this is that we've structured programs for each of you around like how to approach and attack these problems. And I want to talk about a little bit about the strategy that we followed there, just so you can understand kind of the methodology and the madness, because some of the phases that we've introduced to you are more important than others. And let me clarify what I'm talking about. So let me pick on advanced architecture for a second, because I know that Franco, you were in for that one. So let's talk about, for example, the centerpiece of all the programs, which is basically the certification study guide, which is really the thing that we're kind of centering on because it gives you all the structure. And so if I open up this certification study guide and make it so it's not an eye chart so everybody can actually see it, we've already been through a lot of these structures, but right off the bat that we've asked you to take what is basically, especially at the professional and specialty level, we've asked you to take a 3-hour certification, which quite frankly, most people haven't done. And I got to tell you, it's going to bite a lot of people in the rear end, especially as they get to the piece, because frankly, without the assessment, your training is now scattered. You don't know what sections you're weak on. You don't know whether you're ready for the exam or not. And you probably know that you're not ready, but you don't know how not ready you are. So that's why we ask, by the way, that people take this assessment. Of course, all of this is based on John Bonso's like work, who's also on Udemy, by the way, but it's off the Tutorials Dojo website. We all know this. And in this particular case, the section that we're most interested in for every single certification is the first thing we've asked you to do is to take the final test, which is the longest. It's not checked. You're not going to get the answers. It's actually a simulation of you taking the final exam, which is really the end game that we're shooting for. So I wanted to explain the method to that particular madness, because that's like the pre-assessment phase. And what we're seeing right now is that most people haven't done the pre-assessment phase. So hopefully if they see this video, they're like, yeah, we'll do it now, right? Meanwhile, most of you are taking your classes, like in this particular case, the class was last week, right, for the for our architecting pros, the solution architect pros. And then what ends up happening is that there's this study block that goes for a while. And then there's what we call, sorry, and I don't know why it doesn't say study material there, but this study block goes on for a while. And then what happens is that you then move into the exam readiness block, and then you move into an exam block. And the exam block is always the last day of whatever study program you're doing. So in this particular case, it actually says September 24th. You could actually push this forward into next week and just do it on September 30th. There's no issue with that. As long as the certification is taken and passed by October 1st, awesome. So if you need to add an additional week, because this is only like 10 weeks and you need to like get there, great. That's what it's there for. Now, just going back to the study block for a second, notice that the study block has a variety, in this case, a ton of white papers, right? And we've added supplemental labs so you can get hands-on, but just note that like in this particular case, there's a ton of white papers, because that's the bulk of what you do as an architect is you actually design and test based on whatever abilities or non-functional requirements or functional requirements are being presented to you. And so you're having to take in a bunch of information and hopefully contextualize it. But I just want to mention this is that I only am asking for people to do like 70 to 80% of what's here, meaning I don't need you to read these white papers and memorize them. Just scan them, get the high level details, maybe memorize the top level rubrics. Like if you're looking at the well-architected framework and you don't know what the 5 pillars are and you're an architect for AWS, you're going to fail the exam. I'm just going to say this like exactly. Like these are the 5 pillars. So just learn what the 5 pillars are. Now, do you need to now be able to quote all the like sub examples of the 5 pillars of the well-architected framework? No, you don't need to do that. So particularly if you have a white paper heavy path, just know that we want you to get 70 or 80% high level concepts, memorize some of the high level detail, but don't feel like you got to memorize every single piece of this white paper. That is overtraining. This is a trivia exam, so I need you to be able to read the material, take in the general knowledge, and be able to apply it, particularly as it relates to solving the exam questions and exam problems. Now, if you've got digital training in your, which almost everybody does, I don't think anybody doesn't have digital training. When you click in here and you go to digital training, hello, Excel. Oh, it did actually open it, just didn't dominate. What will happen is notice it'll open aws.training. You'll sign in. By the way, you will use an Amazon account. Please, try not to don't use your Booz Allen Hamilton account to open into AWS account. That'll get you into trouble. Everything else you can use a Booz account, and we ask you that you do so. But for this, please don't do that because you'll get a call from security and lots of fun interactions with them. But just know that also in this space, let's say that you're like, is there other stuff here for architects? Under AWS.training, there are other classes that you could use to supplement, especially if there's areas that you feel like you're weak in. We gave you the ones here, the white papers and the digital trainings that were the most relevant for the exam. But we had to limit it. You've got, this is a 10 or 12 week program. We got to pick and choose. If there's other things that you're interested in that you feel are on the exam, like you don't really know deployment models, right? Or maybe you just want to know more about architecting as a domain. Note that you can actually filter this by role and actually see like everything that's here. Notice there's quizzes here, right? Which you don't need, but if you want to play around and get more questions, there are options here. But if you want to dive deeper into a technology, let's say I take architecting off and I need to know more about serverless. Here it is, right? Serverless mindsets, DynamoDB for service, Lambda at edge. There's tons of free trainings here for you to drive your mastery deeper. So just don't forget that in addition to the digital trainings we assigned, if you feel really struggling in an area, you can go deeper in it. So if you're doing database, there's tons of database technologies. If you're doing analytics, there's tons of analytics technologies. You're doing architecture, a lot of it's here, right? Now, the other thing is that you might have workshops or labs in your listings. If you have that, then it's expected that you use your own personal AWS account to do that. But just a word of caution, if you have workshops in your set, don't walk away from those workshops in the middle of things, okay? So like, for example, Franco, I may have shown you this the other day. I'm gonna paste this in the chat just to make sure. But there's a whole like website on well-architected labs. So if you're sick of reading white papers and you need to learn, want to like do some practice to drive reliability home, there's all these labs available under what's called well-architectedlabs.com that you have to use your own account. But just to say this, these are going to cost you less than 25 cents a run. As long as you don't walk away and leave resources running, they're going to cost you like tens of cents. The most I've ever had anybody spend is $3 to do the whole lab set, right? But just know, like, there's a bunch of stuff here to actually drive reliability. If you're an associate's level, you're not going to do the 300 level labs. If you're a professional, you're probably not going to do the 100 level labs, but then that's up to digression. So just know that if you have a workshop or if you just need extra investment, there are tons of other options as far as like workshops and investing, both here and on the QuickLabs site, which we talked about in all of your onboarding, is that as a Booz employee, you have unfettered access to all of the labs at www.quicklabs.com. So as long as you sign up using your bah.com email address. So in the study section, there's plenty of opportunity within the study section to read the white papers, get hands-on experience, do the digital trainings, and you've got other resources just outside the ones we've assigned. So that's all the study block. Any questions about any of that before I move forward?
Nope.
Okay. The other thing to note is that arguably the most important phase is this exam practice, exam readiness phase. Now, notice that it's actually fairly short here. It's a little condensed. just to say this, ideally, you might want to start moving it up just a little bit more, especially if you're on like one of the 12-week programs, like the pro and the specialty exams. The reason for this, and just to drive this particular aspect home, is that these exams, and I'm talking specifically about the review mode exams and the section-based exams, not the timed. At no point in time do we actually do the timed unless you just want to check and see if you're ready to take the exam. Because the timed mode exams on Tutorials Dojo are very similar to the final test. Let me show you what I'm talking about, because that may not make much sense. Tutorials point. I don't even know what that is, actually. Now I'm super interested in that. I have to find that out. Tutorials Dojo. So in Tutorials Dojo, if we go in and let's say I'm going to do Architecture Pro. By the way, Timothy, what exam are you cohort are you part of?
Architecture Pro.
Oh, you sure? So I'm sorry.
Yep.
I should have known that. So if we go and pick on Architecture Pro in particular, the exams that I'm talking about for the exam practice are specifically these review mode exams and these section-based exams. Now, mainly you're going to do review mode exams. And what I want you to do is I want you to take one set of these exams until you get 90 or 95%. Once you get 90 or 95% and you master that, then you can move on to the next. Now, as a strategy, you might be saying to yourself, Michael, why do I need a 95% on these questions? Because you're going to lose 5 points because you're nervous, and you're going to lose 5 points because these questions are not exactly the exam questions. John has a didactic memory, but that just means he has to talk to AWS to make sure he doesn't get sued, which he does, right? Because he's not going to repeat the exam questions from memory like exactly. He's got to like have a conversation. So be aware that we want you to master that one because you're going to lose points, right? So if you end up with an 85, that's great. You only need a 720 to pass. So that's why we're doing this. There's method to the madness, is that we're elevating you up to 95% because we know that questions are going to be stressful and it's going to be weird, right? So 95 percentile in one set, then go to the next set. And then if you want to, you could do a third set, or you could stop there and just review both sets of questions. The general recommendation is if you only have 2 sets of questions, like you're doing DevOps Pro, just do both sets of questions. If you have a third, it's your option about whether you actually start reviewing a third, and you may not even have time to do a third, but if you do, that would be why. The other option is that if you want to start pulling questions in early, let's say that you are reading a white paper on migration and you like to test your knowledge, go and take the section-based exam that week on migration. If you just read about pricing with AWS, then go take the section-based exam on cost control. That will allow you then to test and reinforce your knowledge, which is exactly what these exam questions are for, is to kind of like bolster your ability to recall information, because that's what the exam really is, right? Is to do that. So we're only for the exam practice doing the review mode questions. And if you want to pull the questions in earlier, use the section-based questions, right? And to pull them in. By the way, the reason we're avoiding timed is that time does not give you the immediate answer. So you can't check your answer with timed. And so we only use that when we want to verify if you're ready for the exam. So don't do timed, okay? If you have topic, by the way, you can also do topic-based, but topic doesn't exist for all of them. Topic is like section-based, but instead of these sections, by the way, are the official breakdown by domain of the exam from the exam guide. So these sections like test your like domain knowledge of certain sections of the exam. Topic actually says, here's EC2, here's all the questions on EC2. Topic says, here's S3. But if you don't see topic in your options, then you don't have topic. You either have review and section-based, or you have review, section-based, and topic-based, but most have review and section-based. Okay, any questions about the importance of doing the exam practice, or how to pull it up if you want to pull it up sooner?
This is just a logistical question, and maybe really I should ask Tutorials Dojo, but I actually have my own separate Tutorials Dojo account, so I've been practicing these for a little while. And for some reason in review mode, it just, whether I get it right or wrong, it marks them as correct, which I'm confused.
Does it do that? Do you have a new account with us, or is it only in your old account that it does that?
I haven't tried it in the new account with you, but I've, in my own personal account, it just seems to always mark them as right, which
So
is
it might
weird.
be interesting if you log in with your, booze account and access it in a different user, if it still repeats the same behavior. Obviously, whether it does or doesn't, that can be useful information where you're like, hey, by the way, both accounts, for whatever reason, it only marks them as right.
Mm,
So, but, and you're talking about the SA Pro, right?
yeah,
Test?
yeah,
Okay.
in review mode.
Okay, well, that's interesting because we were actually going to go into review mode. So let's see if it just marks it right regardless. Um, oh, I guess I was in here recently. Yeah, so I would test that, like experiment with that, and then just send the Tutorials Dojo an email and say, hey, I'm getting nothing but right answers here, which is awesome, but that's not going to happen on the exam.
Well, yeah, it'll tell me if it's wrong when I score it, but in the what you're showing there in the recap, it just marks them all green as if they're correct.
Oh yeah, that's weird. Yeah, I would write them about that. That sounds like a bug of some type. Oh, and one other thing to mention about the exam phase, past, the exam practice, is that you want to schedule your exam as soon as you possibly can. At this point, if you're in your second or third week, now's the time for you to schedule your exam. Don't worry, you can move it and you can cancel it. You'll get your money fully back. It won't mess with your voucher, but you should schedule your exam as soon as you can, just to make sure you get the time slot that you need. So like, for example, if you see it says, hey, let's do it on 9/24, you should probably figure out whether it's a Saturday, Sunday, Friday, whatever day of the week you're going to do it. You should figure out when you're going to do that, carve out some time for it. If you need to move it forward later on, you totally can. It's easy to go in and just do it automatically. You don't even have to talk to anybody to do that. They'll let you move it, if I remember correctly, twice, and then you have to cancel it because they're not going to let you move it indefinitely. But then you have to cancel it, but then you get your money back and you can just like recast it if you want to. So it's not really that big of a deal. So just know that everybody who hears my voice in this video and here in person, you want to schedule your exam as soon as possible. So I'm going to make sure that's up front. Okay, any questions about the schedule at all? Okay.
No, I'm good.
All right, so let's talk about the exam itself and let's dive into a few strategies for a second. So if we go back to certification and let's pick on Solutions Architect Pro, as you well know, this is a 75 question, either multiple choice or multiple right choices. It's a professional exam. You can take it online or proctored, which I'm going to talk about that. And you have 180 minutes to take 75 questions, which means just in terms of pacing, that you have about 2.5 minutes, basically, two plus minutes to actually take. But if you burn 3 minutes on a question, you just know that you've lessened your time and ability to take another question, which is fine. Some questions you're going to look at, the answer right away. Others are just going to hook you and your brain's going to melt and you have to read it 3 times in order to get it. That's just standard. But do note that one of the reasons we also have you take the final test is because you got to like practice your pacing. And then you later on might actually take a time mode test or the final test again, because you're going to need to practice your pacing, right? And when you get hung up on a question, you might mark it for review and come back, which is a very common strategy where you're like, and you won't have a watch, by the way, but you'll have a clock in the lower right hand side. But it's like, if you're like, oh, I have spent 2 minutes on this, I don't have the answer, you might want to move on, and then come back to the question after you've gotten all the questions done. Sometimes, particularly with the pro exams, I have gone through and just marked all the questions where I just knew the answer. And then I've gone back through and done first guess on the questions that I'm like, I have a pretty clear idea what it is. And then I've even done a third pass where I go back through and I'm like, I got some stumpers here. Let me make some just educated guesses around this. So, and note that these exams can be proctored online. When you do that, just as a word of caution, get a laptop, step away from your desk, because they will not allow you to have anything on your desk. Like I've got like, Twitch stream decks and owls and multiple cameras and stuff like that. None of that will fly. And if you have 2 monitors, that won't fly either. They're going to make you take a monitor off your desk. So don't do that. Just grab your laptop, maybe grab a long cable, run it from your router and plug it into your laptop, and go sit on the your dining room table. Because here's the other catch. You have to pull your desk away from any walls because you have to take a picture of all 4 sides of your desk. They also acoustically fingerprint your room so nobody can walk in. If you have a dog, they need to be in another room. And you don't want to like cover your mouth or do anything suspicious. And you also don't want to talk out loud. I know, strange. But like, they don't know if you're like, it's hard for them, right? They're trying not to make sure you're not signaling anybody. So it is like difficult for them to figure this out.
Yeah.
So
Just in addition to that, Michael, my last one, they actually had me take a picture of the underside of my desk as well and the back of my laptop.
oh, that's new. That's a new level. I haven't heard that. That's interesting. Interesting piece is that I was sitting here like this. I was like, and they were like, Mr. Forrester, can you take your hands away from your mouth? And I'm like, sure. And then I just wasn't thinking about it. And I was like, because sometimes I rub my beard. I know it's weird, but sometimes I'm like thinking and I'm like doing the whole like Greek thing. And they're like, get your hands away from your mouth, please. And so they, when they hit the second or third warning, they were like, hey, just so you know, like we're starting to approach the line. There's going to be consequences. So they'll be polite and they will let you know. But if you do something sketchy for them, they're going to say something. So just be aware. Pictures of the underside of your desk. Interesting.
Yeah,
So I was on a glass table when I took mine, so they could see through it.
Yeah, I got the same thing, with the hands on the face. I just happened to be leaning, holding my head up with my hand, and they said, you got, no, you got to stop that. And I'm like, sorry.
Yeah. So that's good to know. Yeah, so good. I'm glad somebody else experienced it. Otherwise, it's actually a very pleasurable experience. You do need to show up 20 minutes early to your exam. You need to show up. You need to get online. You need to like go through the system software for Pearson VUE. You absolutely, and it cannot be 15 minutes and it can't be, you need 20 minutes. And you're going to have your phone with you at first because they're going to have to take those pictures and they're going to send you a link and do all this stuff. Or you can use your video camera. But just know that there's a little bit of a process. So don't take it lightly. If you've never done it before, come 30 minutes early. Just give yourself the breathing room. It's going to be worth it. If you show up at 1 and you don't have all your stuff done, you're going to get delayed and they can potentially push your exam forward. So the reason we're here is that if we download the exam guide, for example, for the professional, this is one of the key things as far as like strategies that you want to pay attention to, is that if you're going to do section-based or review-based, make sure that you're spending a lot of your time on questions, as an example, that are primarily focused on either designing for new solutions or doing continuous improvement for existing solutions. When it comes to cost control, migration planning, or designing for organizational complexity, those represent, 1/8 to 1/7. Is that right? 1/7. I think I'd give it 1/7, 1/6. 1/8, 1/7, 1/6 of the exam. Like they're not as weighty. So literally half the exam, give or take, is going to be about migration control, cost control. Migration planning, cost, and organizational complexity. The other entire half of the exam is split between designing for new and refactoring old designs. Okay. So in terms of like architecture, as an example, you probably want to spend most of your time understanding how designs matter. So again, the passing score, right, has stated up here is actually 750 for the professional exams. I think it's 720 for the associates. So, so that's how we're going to focus. If we actually go and look after we figured out that we need to focus on design questions and we look at the review mode questions, there's a whole other set of tactics and strategies that we want to think about here. So let me go back to like another question, like maybe the first one. So here we are designing for new solutions. And just to tell you, these categories don't show up in the exam. They don't categorize them for you. Not that I've ever seen. And I just actually took the recertified on the Solutions Pro here recently. But in this particular case, company has set up a mobile application. The on-premise data center hosts a 3 terabyte MySQL server that handles the write intensive requests. The on-premise network is connected via a VPN to the VPC. And on AWS, the serverless application runs on Lambda and API gateway with a DynamoDB table used for saving preferences. The application scales well as more users are using the mobile app and the user traffic is unpredictable, but there's an average increase of 20% per month that they're seeing as far as traffic. A few months into the operation, the company noticed the exponential increase of costs for Lambda. And so the SA noticed that the Lambda execution time averages 4.5 minutes, and most of it is wait time due to latency when calling the on-premise data server, MySQL data server. So this is like at the pro level, this is the level of questions that you get. Obviously at the associates level, it's a little more simple, but both the pro and specialty, like these are the kind of like scenario based questions that you really frequently get, where it's like, we're going to throw a bunch of information at you and we're going to see if you can notice, one, what we're actually asking for, and two, what services are involved, and do you know enough about the services to have like this kind of thing work. And so in this particular case, the Lambda execution is actually the problem. Don't get me wrong, the rest of that is super relevant, but the Lambda execution is the problem. And from what they're telling you, most of the wait time is actually latency when calling the on-premise MySQL server. So all that other stuff about being connected over a VPN, which could be a factor, but also the other stuff about DynamoDB and Lambda and API gateway, right? We don't know if that's super relevant yet, but it's not the primary factoring. So then as you go through, just notice that also the answers to these questions are actually pretty long and large. Now, one of the first things I usually do is go in and enable it anything that looks ridiculous. Like, for example, if I see any like weird names, for example, which I actually don't see any weird names, so no answers have been eliminated. The other thing I look for as a strategy is, are there duplicates? Are there answers that are almost exactly the same? The only thing that's changed is some minor detail. So notice that here they've like provisioned AWS Direct connection to the VPC instead of a VPN, and they've got the exact same thing with this one as well. So that's interesting, because just to say this, usually when there's two answers that are identical, so notice here that 2 and 3 are fairly, at least they open the same way. Usually when Amazon does that, usually that's where the answer is, right? If there's 3 like that, you know for sure that the answer is one of those 3. Now, then the next thing is like, let's think about what they're trying to accomplish without even really looking at the answer. They have a high Lambda execution time, particularly when it goes back to the MySQL server. And so just to ask, what's the most common design pattern whenever you need to basically solve a latency problem with the database? If you need to bring the data closer, what's the most common thing that we do?
You could just move the database. You could bring it closer, or you could increase the bandwidth. It depends on what your options are.
Right. So you can move the database closer. So you can move the data closer. You can increase the pipe so that latency is less of an issue, because maybe that is an issue. And by the way, get more consistent latency, right? Especially if you do dedicated pipe. And you can also cache, right? So especially if it's data that is cacheable, which not all data is cacheable to get benefits, you could actually bring a cache into play. Especially if it's like long-lived data. If it's data that lives more than like 5 to 10 seconds, it's perfect. Actually, you could actually reduce load and latency that way to a certain degree, right? So there's a couple of different ways to approach it. So, I mean, my first thought is what Franco, what you just said is like, let's migrate this MySQL server to RDS for MySQL. Let's enable multi-AZ for high availability. You know, we can create a CloudFront distribution as the origin to cache the API responses and reduce the Lambda invocations. Caching might help in that case. We could lower the timeout in the memory properties of the Lambda functions without increasing the execution time. That seems a little sketchy, but okay. We could configure auto scaling on the DynamoDB table to automatically adjust with user traffic and enable DynamoDB Accelerator to cache frequently accessed records. But here's the catch. Their primary outcome was they want to reduce overall costs, right? They want to reduce the overall costs. So notice that I'm sitting here talking about optimizing per performance, but that's not what they asked for. They actually asked for optimizing for cost, right? Now, of course, they don't want to wreck the user experience, so Amazon expects you to balance both, right? Just to say this alone, DAX, the Dynamo Accelerator, is a very expensive option for sub-millisecond performance. So first of all, I can tell you right now, that's probably not going to be the answer, because it's got DAX in there, and DAX is not cheap. Not only that, the things that we're suggesting as far as migration, you know, that they are going to increase cost, right? Now, the other two options, as far as provisioning a direct connect connection to a VPC instead of a VPN, to reduce the network latency to the MySQL server. Well, that'll increase the bandwidth, but it's not going to reduce. I mean, it could reduce network latency, but again, we're assuming that if we give a bigger pipe, that will actually help. We can still create a CloudFront distribution to help cache, the origin and whatnot. We could convert the Lambda functions to run them on reserved instances. Well, automatically that's done because we're trying to reduce costs, and converting to Amazon EC2 instances and like enabling auto scaling with a combination of spot instances, that could lower costs, but Lambda is typically fairly efficient. So, and configuring auto scaling on DynamoDB, I don't know. That doesn't necessarily, that makes sense, but I'm just saying like converting to EC2 reserved instances, that's an always on system that you're always paying for. So I don't know that that's actually cheaper. Overall, I bet you it's not actually with EC2. So usually Amazon does not going to recommend a conversion from serverless to EC2. Now this one, the third answer, which basically says the same thing as far as provisioning a direct connect connection, configure caching on the mobile application to lower function calls. That sounds pretty good. Gradually lower the timeout and the memory properties of the Lambda functions without increasing the execution time. Possible. Add an Elasticache cluster in front of the DynamoDB to cache frequently accessed records. That's also not necessarily a problem, although it was user preferences, but fair enough. So that actually is a viable option. And then the last one, which looks remarkably like the first one, so there could be answers here, is migrate the on-premise server to for MySQL, enable multi-AZ, configure caching, gradually lower the timeout memory properties, and then configure auto scaling. But I just want to say this is that actually looks pretty good, but this will actually increase costs actually, because we're bringing it from data center on house. And again, this does actually provide improved performance, but it also increases costs. So if I were to speculate, if we were just going to like focus on just decreasing costs while still taking care of the user, which one of these gentlemen do you think is probably going to be the best answer based on the analysis we just did?
Well, it sounded like, the one you've got clicked there was, but you're not factoring in necessarily the cost of that direct connect circuit. That's got additional cost as well. So that kind of offsets the additional cost for the MySQL, for the RDS. So that's kind of a wash.
Right, and an Elasticache cluster will also add costs, will it not?
Right, right. So the key is how do you reduce that Lambda function from running from 4.5 minutes down, and what's going to save the money there? So to me, step one in both of those are kind of a wash. So what's going to reduce the Lambda function running seems to be the SQL database being closer.
Right.
So
Good.
what's D?
Okay. So D, and like, what's the difference between D and gradually timeout configure? Oh, DAX. DAX is missing.
Yeah, DAX.
Yep, and DAX is significant cost. So let's go with D, because that sounds good, right? Especially on second analysis, because it's like adding an Elasticache cluster is not going to be, it's going to increase costs. Let's see what the right answer is. And bam, there it is. Good. So, right. So in this case, we accomplish the goal. We bring things closer. We're not paying for, something that may or may not actually help. Because what if, again, if we're looking here, it basically says, user traffic's unpredictable. And we know that the wait time is due to latency when calling the on-premise server. So we can either solve that problem, as you said, by moving the server closer or increasing network pipe. Typically, just like caching, the answer is typically to bring things closer, right? And of course, Amazon's going to advocate for moving into the cloud. So that's another thing to consider, is that they want you to bring it in.
I was just going to say, I know, I'm sure it's not an official stance, but in general, the answers probably should lean towards using more AWS services than less, right? Because obviously they're in the business of making money.
And Franco, you're absolutely right. So these exams, there's the right way, the wrong way, and there's the Amazon way, just like the exams for any other vendor like Microsoft or whoever for the last 20 years, is that they are actually using these exams to expose a certain mindset. And the mindset is, there's two pieces to that. So I'm glad you brought that up, is one, give us as much operational offloading as possible. Let us run your infrastructure, right? The other piece is that as part of that operational offloading, try to use managed services as much as possible. Like they would never advocate ever. I've never seen them advocate going from Lambda back to EC2. Not only do the numbers not necessarily make sense for that, right? Unless, depending on your application profile, but they would never advocate for that. They also, by the way, don't advocate for third parties. So third parties will never really, like, there's one exception of that around networking, routing and stuff. But for the most part, I've never seen them advocate for a third party solution.
Right, and probably I would bet, they're always going to lean towards, let's say, RDS versus running, SQL on an EC2. So
Right.
that's always going to be a wrong answer.
They're always going to go up for managed services. So if you're at infrastructure as a service, they want you to go to platform. If you're at platform, they want you to go software
Right.
as a service. Yeah, that's exactly right. So those are strategies to keep in mind, is that if you're like, I'm not really sure what they're going for, they're going to lean towards those things: more consumption, higher, more abstraction of services, and no third parties. So good. It sounds, you guys sound like veterans, actually. Of course, the right answers and the wrong answers are here, which is incredibly important, because it actually could justifies everything that we were just speculating about, right? And he'll even go in and say, hey, by the way, this is not economical. This is why we're not doing this, right? And by the way, I wouldn't mention this, is that CloudFront can do caching, but if you have an API gateway in front of it, obviously that's where you would turn it on. And of course, EC2 reserved instances are going to be more expensive, especially when application traffic is at its lowest peak, right? So, and then DAX, right? That echoes exactly what I just said. DAX is expensive. This is if you need like microseconds response time, not milliseconds response time. Okay, let's do another one, because I feel like we actually hit a bunch of really high level strategies there as far as like the way Amazon thinks about it. Okay, one more. So we've got a company that's created multiple accounts in AWS to support the rapid growth of its cloud services. The multiple accounts are used to separate their various departments. Each account's managed by an SA who has root account access just for that specific sub account. Finance, right? In this case, human resources engineering. There's a requirement to centrally manage policies across all the multiple accounts by allowing or denying particular AWS services for individual accounts or for groups of accounts. What's the most suitable solution that you can use with the least amount of complexity? So in this, it says you can set up organizations with OUs, connect all AWS accounts of each department, and then create a custom IAM policy to allow or deny the use of certain AWS services for each account. You can use AWS organizations and SCP, service control policies, to control the list of services that can be used by each member account. And then you can provide access to externally authenticated users via Identity Federation, set up an IAM role for specific permissions for users from each department whose identity is actually federated with our third-party provider. And then connect all departments by setting up cross-account access to each of the AWS accounts of the company. Create and attach IAM policies to your resources based on their respective departments to control access. So which one of these sounds like it would actually do the least amount of complexity if you wanted basically to control whether someone was allowing or denying access to services?
Sounds like the definition of SCPs.
Yeah, I was gonna say B. I mean, anything with IAM is gonna be complicated anyway.
Right. And so you have to know that, like, in this particular case, SCPs are the standard policy control unit for organizations. And you have to know that organizations is the best way to manage multiple accounts, right? I mean, even Control Tower and Landing Zone, which are like, these kind of like vending machine style services, they actually use organizations as the underpinning or service to manage everything. So I agree completely. Now, when we go and check this, right, the other thing is that do SCPs deny or allow the use of services? Do they enable the use of services, or do they deny the use of services?
I believe they deny.
Yeah, they deny, right? So they basically, thou shalt not, right? That's what SCPs do. You can't use the quantum computing service. No one needs a computing service because nobody in our organization needs to be doing quantum computing. You can just block that off, or virtual reality, or whatever, satellite ground station, right? But that, it doesn't replace that. You actually still have to have the individual accounts go in and set up their allow policies, right, for IAM users. But here was the reason why that worked, is because there's a system administrator there for each of the particular departments. So actually, The least amount of complexity was just, let's just block off stuff that some people shouldn't be using company wide. And we've got an SA there of some type who can actually just still handle everything he or she's going to handle anyway, which is allowing access. So this actually works out really well. Again, note that in this particular case, the first thing we had to do was really understand what was the best service, how does that service work, and what are the components of that service, something that is very much expected for all of the SA Pro exams, okay? So I think we hit the main strategies, which is like, make sure if you have multiple answers that it's going to be like in those sets. Don't let that trap you. If there's 3 of them, it's most likely that. If there's 2 of them, especially if there's 2 sets, then all bets are off. You actually just need to look at each question and make sure it works. Make sure that you're centering for the outcome. The outcome in this case was that what's the most suitable solution for the least amount of complexity? For the previous question, it was what's the cheapest and still like reduce latency, right? So it was asking those like particular questions. So you need to, they're always going to put you in a bind. What's going to give me the least complexity and yet still accomplish the goal? What's going to give me the most scalability and still accomplish the goal? What's going to give me the cheapest and still accomplish the goal? They will always do that, because being an architect is about making those kind of like trade-offs, right? So just know, in particular for architecture, but this is true for the others as well, is that they're going to put you in a bind. And so you need to make sure that you're always answering the question and the objective, because they always give you a qualifier for the objective. I want you to solve this problem, do it the cheapest way possible. I want you to solve this problem, do it the easiest way possible. I want you to solve this problem, do it the most scalable way possible. So be very mindful that they're always going to put you into those kinds of conflicts. The other thing, just to reinforce what Franco and Timothy were saying, is that basically, hey, no third parties. Amazon wants you to use more services. So that's typically the answer, right? And then, make sure that you are going up the chain. So if it's a choice between infrastructure as a service versus platform, like RDS versus hosting your own database, Amazon's going to want you to host. If it's a choice between running Lambda versus running, let's even say like Elastic Beanstalk, they're going to they want you to choose Lambda, right? Because Amazon's trying to take as much operational offload off of you as possible, and they want you to do it. So just know that that remains consistent thematically, regardless of which exam you're taking. Okay. One last thing to point out. Note that you get the right answers, the wrong answers, and then you get the original references when you take the review exams. And if John has a cheat sheet, because you keep, just say this, like you keep messing up the questions on organizations, you're probably going to want to go read the documentation on organizations and then read his cheat sheet as well. Just to skim it. You don't have to like memorize every single detail of it, but make sure you understand what the components are, especially if like you didn't understand SCPs. Probably want to go back and read an SCP and understand what it does. Okay. So other than that, that's it. That's all I got, is that I wanted to make sure you understood the phases, the whys, a little bit of the strategy about why we're doing the exam questions, why you did a final test, why you're doing the review mode and the section-based modes. And then in the test itself, why you want to do a little bit of breakdown on the questions, focus on the outcome of the question they're asking, and understand that they're always going to put you in a bind. Do this way, do this way. The question will always have a qualifier to it, unless it's a pure service question, which is relatively rare. Which service is best for this function, right? That's it. Otherwise, I don't have anything else, gentlemen, unless you have something else to discuss, cover, or talk about.
Not for me. Thank you. Appreciate the time.
No, nothing for me. Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you.
Excellent. So I'll put this other video and the video that we just recorded just now into a playlist, and I'll just post it into the various base camps. So in case you need to review something or capture it, it's all in there. Otherwise, today is what, Wednesday? Have a fabulous week.
Great. You do the same. Thanks.
Thanks, you
All
too,
right.
Michael.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.